Christopher met Winter's eyes across the head of the crouched Merrin, and gesturing him to follow, Winter stalked after Razzie. They followed a wide trail of broken brush that cut a blood-stained path through the trees, and after a couple of yards they came to another horse, mercifully dead this time, its throat ripped cleanly out, a quick kill. The Merrin were stripping it of its final tack, grimly pulling the saddle from its back, undoing the buckles of the harness. Its wolf skin was casually flung onto the growing pile of Luke Garreau equipment, and its jewelled eyes seemed to follow Christopher and Wynne as they padded slowly by. The horse's rider was sprawled in the trees a yard or so further on. Halvor was crouched over the body, her back to them. Ulfnar's dogs were standing by, panting happily, their tails wagging. As Christopher and Wynne came up the trail, the hounds looked up in unison, grinning, their long tongues lolling from their mouths. They were painted in gore, their wiry fur matted with blood. There was a sudden, brutal, cracking sound as Halvor began sawing at something with her knife. The dogs whined in excitement, bowing and snuffling. As Winter and Christopher slid past, Alvor, her arms elbow-deep in blood, sat back on her haunches, revealing the man's body. And Winter saw that he had been raggedly decapitated. There was no sign of his head. Halvor had cracked open his rib cage and was now calling to the eager dogs, offering the man's heart to the hounds who had killed him. She split the organ in two, and Winter watched in sick fascination as the huge creature stepped forward and delicately took a half each from Halvor's dripping fingers. "Maithia Vercuna," murmured the healer, wiping her arms on the dead man's shirt. Two other Merrin came down the trail, and Halvor motioned them to help her strip the Luke Garreau of his finery. Christopher pulled Winter along by her elbow, and they moved on, following the sounds of people moving through the trees, so that they found themselves back on the edge of the grass plains. Razzie stood with his back to them, his falchion sword still in his hand. He was watching as a group of Merrin gathered around Ulfnor and Wari. They seemed to be looking at something that lay on the ground at their feet. As Winter and Christopher stepped from the trees, Ashker pushed his way through the ranks of the Merrin, his dogs at his heels. He was carrying something in his hand. It took Winter's numb brain a few seconds to realize that it was a dripping human head. Once the Merrin saw who it was that was shoving them aside, they parted ranks and let Ashker through to the centre of the circle, stepping back to give him room. His dogs immediately tried to get past him, and at the sight of them, the shape on the ground cried out in fear. "Oh my God," thought Winter, "that's a man." Ashker roared at his dogs, and they backed down at once, dropping to their bellies in the dirt. The man on the ground made an awful, spasming, uncoordinated attempt to crawl away, and Wari kicked him into stillness. The man howled and abruptly lurched upwards, screaming a shriek of vile curses at the man. At the sound of the wolf's voice, Christopher flinched, and Winter felt him draw away. She placed a reassuring hand on his back, her eyes still on Razzie. Stepping between the Merrian warriors, Razzie admitted himself to the inner circle and then stalked around to look down at the man on the ground. He came to a halt beside Ashker, and the two men stood side by side, dark and light, both gazing coldly down at the wolf by their feet. Winter thought Razzie looked oddly detached and speculative, like a trader in a mart sizing up a substandard horse. She slipped unheeded through the warriors and into the inner circle. Christopher drifted in her wake, but once he was within the ring of Merrin, he came to a halt on the edge of things, motionless and silent, his head down. Embla was standing by Ulfnar, her sword in her hand, her warhounds flanking her, and to Winter's amazement, Solmundr was there too. The lady had her free arm around his waist, holding him up, and Winter moved around to stand by their side, and so got her first good look at one of David Le Garreau's wolves. He was young, mid-20s at the most, clean-shaven with shoulder-length brown hair. Winter's eyes were drawn inexorably to the chewed mass of his legs and the way he was holding his exposed gut into his belly with both hands. She fought down a hot surge of vomit and pulled her attention back to the angry contortion of his expression. He was staring at worry, his eyes a vivid blue in the chalky white of his face. "You God-cursed savage," he spat in choked Cabret. "You horse and vagabond! David will eat your pox-riddled heart, you hear me? He'll burn your eyes, you..." Ashker crouched abruptly by his side and leant forward to make eye contact. The wolf flinched away in momentary fear, but quickly gathered himself and snarled defiantly once more, "Stand back, you cur! I have no wish to share your fleas." Ashker nodded. "See your friend?" he said. He placed the severed head on the ground. It had been chewed and savaged by the hounds as they tore it from the owner's body, but the features were still recognisable. Ashker turned the head to face the now silent wolf. Gently he pulled the clinging hair from its lifeless forehead, tucked it neatly behind the bloodied ears. He lifted his eyes to those of the wolf. "See your friend?" he repeated, and tapped the dead cheek. "And the lucky one." The wolf stared at the slack-lipped, waxy face of his dead companion, and then drew back and gobbed a long and bloody spit at Ashker. Winter jumped, her sword jerking upwards, but Ashker just sighed and wiped his face with the hem of his shirt. "That's very silly," he said, his voice just as soft as before. "I'm the only person here who might have killed you before you two broke enough to care." He sucked his teeth and spread his hands. "Oh well," he said, and stood up, smiling down at the man. "Oh well." The wolf fell back, his knees drawing up to his torn belly. His eyes scanned the ring of faces glowering down at him, and Winter saw Christopher shrink back against the surrounding merrin, his eyes fluttering, his face turned away in fear. The pain overtook the wolf before he could find Christopher, and he gasped, rolling to his side, and locked his eyes with Razzie. They knew each other well. Winter saw it in the shock that froze the wolf's face, and in the slow, cold satisfaction that spread itself into Razzie's smile. "Sawal halkir in," said Razzie quietly, wishing the man good morning in Arabic. The wolf lurched, as if he would have been jumping to his feet if not so hideously wounded, and he stared at Razzie. Then his lip curved into a knowing sneer, and his eyes hardened. Razzie grinned at him. The merrin frowned, and there was a sudden, wary reappraisal of this dark young man with the sword in his hand. The wolf muttered something in Arabic, and then gurgled a clog laugh, his lips spattered red. "It is you," he said in Hadrish. As he bowed, spread his arms sarcastically. "Ah, David knew it," hissed the wolf. "He knew it. Gerard said you were dead, but David knew as soon as the boys brought those bracelets back to camp." He shifted painfully, his eyes roaming the crowd, certain. "He knew it was your little mongrel, and where the mongrel is, the master ain't never far. Ha!" He had found Christopher, at last. Razzie stepped forward, his sword jerking compulsively upward. The wolf laughed, contorting his body around to see the pale young man standing at the edge of the crowd. Christopher flicked him the briefest of glances, slid a look at Winter, and then dropped his gaze. His face was perfectly blank, his body perfectly still. The wolf twisted in the dust and grinned up at Razzie once more. "David is looking for you, Ya Al-Saeed," he said. "He'll find you. You haven't a hope." And that's the end of that.